Oh, sorry. I didn't see you there. Just kidding. That's what happens when you stay in a room with your camera all day, and you go outside and you try to take a walk, and it's still raining. Just start making stupid jokes, and that's the first time I've done that. I think you can probably check. There's about 300 videos in my channel. They're all like this. I mean, we might as well do something slightly different. Me pretending that I didn't see you there when I actually can't see you there is the joke. But let's get the business done. This is the third lecture I've done today, so I'll try to stay on track and get it done without too many tangents. The 14th century, in other words, the 1300s. Last lecture, earlier today, I messed that up. I kept saying 13th century, I think, or whatever. 1300s, so it means the 14th century means everything up until, 1400s. I didn't say that properly a few times. There's a few reasons why this period is so important to England. If you're talking about another culture, or you're talking about another history or another state, you would choose a different time as a critical sort of turning point, right? Of the culture. If I was going to talk about, I am going to talk about, if I was going to talk about, which I will talk about, American culture, it's the 18th century that really defines the United States. They do have the Civil War, but American culture is just easily divisible all the time. And British culture is not so much, I feel. It's a little bit more difficult to nail down certain periods and how they affected things, because it's not as revolutionary a culture. It doesn't have this sort of this pivoting of the culture towards it in a different direction. There's lots of developments. They just are more methodical, and things happen step by step. And there's not a clear division between, okay, this is not war, and then it's war. The 100 Years' War is a perfect example. And throughout, it starts in the 13th century, and it's going to start, I said 13th century again. I'm not going to record this again. I've already tried twice. The 14th century, please remember, when I say 14th century, I mean 1300s. The war is going to be started by Edward III. And I told you, it doesn't really matter. Just remember that an Edward started it, I guess. And it's not 100 years, it's 116 years. The end of it is more important. The end of it is 1453. But it's really actually, they call it the 100 Years' War, but they're not fighting for 100 years. No country could fight a war for 100 years. That's a ridiculous thing to claim. So why is it called that? Because they just didn't, they had sort of temporary pieces, but they didn't give up. The British essentially tried to hold on to France, and they almost took it over in the early 1400s, the 15th century, which we're just going to skip that whole thing. This huge, moment where Henry V is juggling England and France's crowns in both hands, and then he dies, and the next king is a baby, 2 years old. So they lose the crown of France. France just says, okay, well, your king was a super scary, dominant, powerful, articulate master of war, and now your king's a baby. So we're not going to make him, even though he's supposed to be the crown prince of France and he's supposed to be king of France and England, they just say, we don't recognize him. And then they just steadily kick out the English until there's nothing left except for Calais, which I've mentioned a few times. It's just the closest point to England, and the French, I mean, I don't know. They just kind of take over everything and just say, okay, you can have this little piece, almost like a joke. Don't know exactly what is humorous about it, but the English are kind of paranoid about France attacking them with good reason. So having France, an giant, larger, more dangerous country, free to attack them by ship whenever they wanted is not ideal. So I mean the French just say, okay, you can have one port, to just leave your finger there, just to watch us a little bit, just not that it matters, but okay. And the islands in between France and England, the Channel Islands, they're Norman. They're controlled by the Duke of Normandy, and they never lose control of them. So, you can go to the islands between France and England. They belong to England because France took back all the land, and they had enough problems inside France, keeping France together. I guess that's the bottom line, is that they just leave Calais there, and it's so close to England. It's 20 kilometers away, so 30 kilometers away. I think it's 20 miles. 30 kilometers away, so you can just send ships over there and attack it really easily. So why not just let them keep it and behave yourself, or we'll take it back. And they do. They behave themselves for 100 years, but then Queen Mary, Henry VIII's daughter, is going to lose it. Okay, so back to what we were talking about. 100 Years' War. Typical example. It's not in the textbook. The reason it's not in the textbook is because it's too complicated and it's too long, and we'd never finish this course if I talked about it. So, in the background of all these other things that are happening, they're at war. England's at war with France for 100 years. And when they fight Napoleon, some people consider that, we'll talk about how often England and France fight each other. It's because they're close and because they're related and because they're threatening each other. And there's lots of reasons why they're entangled this much. But from this period, from the 14th century right up until World War One, again, 500 years sort of thing. The Crusades are over. The French and the English and the Europeans are kicked out of the Middle East. They're gone. They're not coming back until World War II, when the French and the English become friends again. Weirdly, unexpectedly, the Germans obviously not big fans of the French and the English working together. It keeps them busy, allows Germany to do its own thing. So this is in the background. There's a war going on. It lasts forever. Finally, at the end, the famous, person you probably know is the French call her Jeanne d'Arc, or we call her in English Joan of Arc. So I'll write it in English since she is a woman who is young and dresses up as a warrior, as a soldier, and fights against the English. She believes that God has given her, has assigned her the task of expelling the English from France, and they do. And she gets killed. She gets burned as a witch. Eventually becomes Saint Joan of Arc. 500 years later, the Pope makes her a saint. But not at the time, she's sort of on the borderline between a crazy person and a saint, which is a weird place to be, I guess. But that's all happening in the background. To the main story in England, which is first, there's a terrible famine. 1315 is the date that we get for the worst of this period, but it's more like, again, with the English, it's never that kind of precise barrier between this and that happening, usually, although the third thing will be an exception to that. But around 1315 is when it peaks, and there's just, the weather is bad, and the food production is basically reduced. There has been good weather and warmer than normal temperatures in Northern Europe for several hundred years. So the population has increased beyond its normal capacity. So let's say there's about 6 million English people, and they can provide food for all of them, for most of them, until the weather is bad. And then at the same time, there's a disease and plague that goes around, kills all the cows and the sheep. Everybody's sick and there's not enough food. Possibly, half the population doesn't get enough food. And maybe 1 million of the people in England die of starvation, not having enough food. So this is a brutal, terrible period, about 7 or 8 years, where the harvests fail, and the summer's very short, and it's very cool and very wet, and everybody's sick all the time. So people survive, as they do, because we're still here. The people survive. They persisted, but they're all kind of not as strong as they should be. Their immune systems are damaged. They haven't eaten properly growing up. So they're all, most of the people, not all, and at the same time, they're trying, this generation grows up and then they start fighting against the French. Not a great idea, because right after that, in 1342, we get the Black Death arriving in England finally. Around that time, there's a ship that comes from France, probably from Bordeaux, probably delivering wine. A bunch of rats are on there, a bunch of sick people are on there. They jump off the ships, or get off the ships, or don't. But the disease ends up in England and starts spreading. We say 1342, 1348 is the peak of the Black Death, but again, just like I said, it's not a specific date or a day that this happens. It happens over years and years, and it just, one of the things about the Black Death that people don't realize is it just doesn't kill people one by one. It kills a huge amount of people, and then it kind of goes away for a while, and then it comes back, and it kills more people, and it comes back, and it kills, and the cumulative effect of this is, in cities, half the people that are dead. People are leaving cities. People are trying to burn property. People are paranoid. Trade breaks down. Traveling is reduced. It's like COVID, except for nuclear COVID. You guys lived through this. I know you were young, but the coronavirus is just when it happened, I was kind of like, there's something that we can all look at and be like, yeah, it was like that, except for way worse, because everything was dirty. There was no social distancing. There was no masks. There was no vaccines. There was no options. There was no medicine for fevers. doctors, everybody's dying. It, you know, sometimes it kills all the people who do a certain thing. Like in a town, you need a person who is good at making things out of metal, and someone is good at making things out of wood. Carpenters and, you know, locksmiths, for example, people who make locks or things, complicated things, which require skills that need to be trained. So there's only one or two of these people in town. They both die, and then you can't get anything made out of metal. So you can't have a hammer or a horseshoe or, you know, whatever, leather workers, you know, things that are made out of leather from the hide of animals. All these specialized trades they get. Some people get, all the people doing that certain thing get wiped out. So, this causes a breakdown of society. So, there's a crisis that the Black Death causes, and that's why this is called the tumultuous century, right? Tumult is a word that means like unstable, stormy, you know, chaos and damage and suffering. So that's the title I chose for that section in the book. Let me just peg it. I have it. Yeah. Page 75. So there's going to be a description there. It's quite short. I'm giving you a lot more information here. But in the book, it's page 75 to page 76. That's it. But it's a critical period. One, because it kills all these people and leaves holes, punches holes in the whole structure of society. So we talked about the chain of being, right? And this sort of ladder of people where everybody's here or there or belongs in a certain place. But this is the thing that really causes, more than anything else, more than death and taxes or anything else. Well, this is death. I wrote down death and taxes last lecture. But more than anything else, this is a cause of massive death that just erases section of the population. But here and there and everywhere, you know, nobody's safe from the plague. So you end up with rich people getting killed too, less often because they can escape. They have ways to, you know, survive outside of, like, they don't have to work, you know. They can go into the countryside, into a castle, and sort of survive away from the most dangerous places for a while. But regular people can't. They're living, you know, day to day. So they have to eat, they have to work, and as a consequence, they die. Nowhere is this more obvious probably than in the church, because it actually takes a lot of education and it takes a lot of focus and time and concentration in order to become, you know, that level. I said before, you know, the way to move up and down the chain of being, you know, the way that people could advance in society would be, okay, I said specialized skills, but normally that was sort of in the family too. So not the best way to do it. If you're going to escape, you know, your destiny to be a blacksmith or a farmer or a slave or something, you would be able to do it through studying, right? As we do now, sometimes, to increase your chances of succeeding and having success and progressing in life. You could join the church, and you'd have to study hard, and you'd have to spend time and money to do that. Many of these people who have done this, they die, and they're not replaceable immediately. So you end up with much less effective, you know, priests and nuns and abbots and everything. Not to say that they were perfect before that. There was lots of people who were rich and just kind of used their money and their influence and their power to get into the church. But they're, by and large, for the bottom level of the church, the people, the parish priests, and the people who are actually serving the population, they're in the most risky situations. They're they're the front line. We would call in emergency situations, or in COVID, we call this the frontline workers, the emergency workers. They're supposed to be there to help people when they're in need, when they're sick, and when they're tired, and when they're dying. And the best priests do that, and they get killed by it. And the lazy ones, the ones that avoid their duties, I guess, their responsibilities towards the spiritual responsibilities, especially of people who are trying to confess or trying to, get their last rites before they die, so that they can be accepted. When they die, their soul can be at rest. The best people are right there being infected and have a higher chance of dying. And the ones that avoid that have a higher chance of surviving. So you end up with less skilled people in all situations. But, I think the church suffers a lot. And John Wycliffe, he is a priest. He goes to Oxford. You have to read about him. But his ideas are very proto-Reformation, very almost communist. He rejects all the wealth and the material sort of possessions. He leads a group called the Lollards, and he thinks everybody should be able to read the Bible themselves. He believes that everybody should be literate, not just priests, and that the Bible should be available in English, and that the church should give away all its property to the people and the public. So should the rich people, but especially the church. Thinks the church's responsibility is to the people first, and their spiritual needs and their material needs first, not to themselves. He becomes very popular, but basically his movement gets squashed by the next event. Now, I'm going to have to review this event, the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, because this is a culmination of 100 years, or 150 years if you go back to the Magna Carta. There's peasants' revolts everywhere. There's bigger ones and smaller ones, lesser known ones in different countries, in France and Germany. Everywhere in Europe, there's similar things are happening. For England, it's 1381. So if you look it up on the internet and he's like, hey, this is not the right year. Well, this is the right year for England, but for other countries, there's bigger ones in different years. But the 1381 Peasants' Revolt is the one that we are concerned with, and it's going to demonstrate to the king, who's a young kid, as it happens. Again, we got like a ruler with less experience, and he's fighting, trying to do the war, manage the war. His uncles are helping him. There's a whole bunch of things happening. The 100 Years' War is happening, but he's only like 10 years old. Elementary school students aren't great generals ever. I've never heard, Mozart could compose music when he was 10 and play the violin, but Alexander the Great was not 10. Julius Caesar was not 10. Napoleon was not 10. There's no generals, there's no military guys who are not adults. They might be 18, but they're not 10. So he doesn't get blamed for it because he's a kid and he's the king. But the the amount of death from the Black Death and the famine before that, and just like, the oppression of everybody almost working to death all the time, slavery, they explode. So it becomes a revolt, not a revolution. As you may notice, revolt is sort of the beginning of a revolution, but they don't pull it off, and everything. I will talk about this in class, so we'll talk about this. But page 79 in the textbook really sort of talks about that, and the everything sort of collapses to the point where English becomes, instead of this being like this bilingual, I'm French, I'm English at the same time, I got two crowns, everything gets cut off by 1453. And in a way, some people say the 100 Years' War creates two countries, the same way that the Revolutionary War in Canada, Revolutionary War, I am Canadian. The Revolutionary War in America, everybody knows the United States is born. And as a consequence, though, there's another alternative, place north of the United States, which starts to develop and eventually becomes Canada. So, I think, the American Revolutionary War actually creates two states. It creates United States of America, and later it will sort of cause, as a side effect almost, it'll cause Canada to become a country too. Otherwise, it would have remained a colony, but it needed its own strength of resistance, and so it starts to coalesce into a federation of its own states, which we call provinces. All right, so back to the Revolution. Rewind from Canada all the way back here. We've got the 100 Years' War ending in 1453, and peasants' revolt, everything. And as a result of all of these problems, pretty much the king, the government and the crown, which is controlled by the king and his advisors, his council, they sort of react, that they crush the revolt, and they tell everybody to go home, and they kill all the leaders, and they say, your life is going to be worse than it ever was before. You'll regret this. And then they at the same time, they're like, okay, no more slavery. You're allowed to work for who you want. Like one of the positive consequences, ironically, because there is positive consequences of the Black Death, is that there's so many people that die that the remaining people get paid more, because labor is at a premium. Where you could get 2 or 3 people before, now you can only get 1. And so it's the golden age of labor, the next century, not the 14th century, because it's tumultuous and it's brutal, but the next century, there's all these holes in society and people can move up. That's another promotion, right? Opportunity. All these people disappearing means that there are people that can take those spots. So they do. And some towns just disappear because they fall apart, and they don't have blacksmiths, and they don't have leather workers, and they don't have tanners, and they don't, whatever. They don't have people to support the town, so everybody goes somewhere else, and the village or the town just falls apart, and the forest grows over top of it. That's negative, I would say, in my opinion. But at the same time, those open spaces in other places are available. Paid more opportunity, more. So, farmers end up, because of the change in the law, they end up being able to own their own farms, own their own land, and become independent. And these people are called yeomen. I know that's I don't even know how to spell it. It's yeoman is pronunciation, but it looks like yaman. Maybe that's the way it was pronounced. I'm not sure. But anyway, these yeomen, they're farmers. But the difference is they're not working for a castle. They're not working for the Norman lord. They own their own cottage, their own, farmstead, not cottage. Cottage would be more of a renting thing. That's very small. But they can build. They get enough money so that they can build a proper house and have a farm. And the creation of this class, it's not a middle class, although we would probably compare the creation of a middle class to the creation of this group of people that they own things. They have money and they start to have chances to become more important. And ultimately, really, this is going to be Shakespeare. His dad owns some land. His dad becomes a government officer. His mother is from a rich family. They get married, even though his father is, like, his mom's from a rich background, from a noble family, but they get married. Same thing with his wife. Shakespeare's wife is higher level than him, descended from more important people. Same thing happens with him as his father, and they sort of marry into the wealth. They work hard, and by the time Shakespeare dies, he's a gentleman. Couldn't do that. I think it would be impossible to have a Shakespeare before Peasants' Revolt. But we do have a guy named Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer is from a family of rich people, and he's a diplomat. He's connected to the court. His parents are connected to the court. You can tell Chaucer would be the pronunciation of his name in France. Maybe his ancestors were, made some kind of fancy socks or something. I don't know. I don't know if that's scholarship is available or not, but I think his father was a wine merchant, and wine merchants normally bought their wine from France and sold it in England. And so he was, tradesman, royal court, noble, connected guy, and he wrote Canterbury Tales. And without Chaucer, you don't have Shakespeare. And he's a product of the Black Death and of the whole, disruption of society. And what Canterbury Tales is a story about people, about the society, medieval society of England. He learns how to write well from reading Italian translations and Latin versions of Petrarch, and I don't know if he read Dante, but he definitely he reads Italian poets, Boccaccio and Petrarch. So these Italian guys, they get their knowledge and information through Greek and Arabic. For those of you who are Islam, people who believe in Islam, they preserve some of the Roman texts by translating them into Greek and Roman, Latin and Greek, into Arabic, and then starts going back into Spanish and French and Italian first, mostly, in Spanish, and then French, and finally English. And that whole process, as a cultural influence, it's an interesting backdoor into the European Renaissance, is that the Crusades fail, and when the Crusaders come back, they get sucked back into, Europe, all the way back into England. They pull back with them all of this knowledge, from the center of the world, from the Middle East, and from Palestine and Syria, and from the golden age of Islam. So we all owe each other a lot, and it's great to have a lot of different students in this class so we can appreciate, the diversity of the background, of the learning that produces the culture. I think the best parts. We are going to talk about the bad parts too. There's plenty of that. Plenty of bad parts to talk about, for sure. But for now, that's a positive twist. So, putting a positive twist on the Black Death sounds like impossible work, but not so hard, actually. As it turns out, sometimes, it's a crisis of opportunity. I think Winston Churchill is one of the guys who said that, famous British Prime Minister. So, that's it for today, for real. Number 3, in the books. Now you have plenty of material. Chuseok is over, I'm afraid, but we have lots of vacation time left. So I'll see you next week. I will record more another day, but that's it for today. Thank you for listening.